Thank you. I'm so honored to be having this conversation with you today.
I'm honored to be having this conversation with you. Thanks for your leadership.
I'd love if you could just give a brief synopsis of who you are, where you represent, and your just brief history of being a United States Senator.
Sure. My name is Tammy Baldwin. I am currently the junior United States Senator for the great state of Wisconsin. My election made history in that I was the first out LGBTQ senator ever sworn into the US Senate. So it was a big first. And prior to that, I have served at various levels of government in elective office.
Such a rich history of public servitude and just making sure that we're taking care of all the people in our community from a local level to a national level. And I respect that so much. But notably, you're also one of the senators most responsible for the passage of the Respect for Marriage Act. I had the honor of being at the White House yesterday when President Biden signed it into law. And I have a couple of questions to ask you about the now law that'll be put into place. This is a very contentious time for political conversations concerning the LGBTQ plus community. It's not something that is roundly accepted on both sides of the aisle. And this was notably a bipartisan bill. What kind of conversations did it take to push this bill over the finish line and bring Republican colleagues on to make this become a reality?
Such a great question. And I think that respect for marriage occupies a sort of unique place in the larger civil rights struggle for advancing equality for the LGBTQ community. And part of that is because of a case that was decided by the US Supreme Court in 2015, that after years and years of agitating and activism, et cetera, it finally established marriage equality as the law of the land in the United States. Prior to that time, same-sex couples and families were pretty invisible because they couldn't get in certain states, marriage equality came earlier than it did to the entire United States. But what's happened since that decision is that now I think we're close to 1 million same-sex couples in the United States who are married. Many have children and are known to their family, their neighbors, their fellow congregants at church, their co-workers. They are known in the community. So there are far fewer colleagues of mine in the United States Senate who could claim to me, oh, I don't know any gay couples. They get the fact that we want to protect our families and that we need the legal tools of civil marriage in order to do that. So I think the starting point with public opinion in the United States going from just a minority supporting the achievement of marriage equality to now having over 70% of Americans, including a majority of Republicans, supporting marriage equality, it was a different conversation with my Republican colleagues in the United States Senate than it would have been 10 years ago. Even those who couldn't figure out a way to get to yes to support passage of the act, many said, oh, this is hard for me. I have a cousin, or anyways, our visibility has changed the debate.
I'm really glad to hear that. Like you said, you were elected in 2013, and I know since then the national narrative around the LGBTQ plus community has shifted so dramatically. I mean, even from the time when I was, I think, 11 in 2013, and coming up in that transition period has been incredibly interesting. As the country has kind of shifted our mentality and acceptance has grown, I know you're having a lot of negotiations with your colleagues and conversations, but how has the temperament inside the chambers of Congress changed, both in front of the American people and behind the scenes more so? Is there more acceptance? Is it more wanting to be a little bit less open about your support? How has that dynamic shifted?
Oh, that's such a great question. And so let me just say that given my age compared to yours, I remember what the conversations felt like in the 1980s and 1990s and the early 2000s. And there, when you look at the longer time horizon, oh my God, it's a seismic shift in the way people are able to converse about the topic. But I will say, just in that time, that again, more and more people know people who identify in the LGBTQ plus community. But I would say one of the areas where there's still massive misinformation and lack of knowledge and lack of knowing real people is with the transgender and non-binary community. There's still a huge learning curve, I would say, both in America at large, but also among public officials in elective office. So on one hand, we're celebrating this great victory of a legislative body saying, we respect your marriages, right? And then we're seeing in states across the country and in hearings and press releases on Capitol Hill, this absolute ignorant rhetoric and hurtful rhetoric around especially trans youth, but transgender individuals and non-binary individuals in general. It's hard to describe how your heart is warmed by the progress we're making, and then it's broken the next moment by somebody saying something so misinformed.
That's a very important point to be made about acceptance within the transgender community, because that is something that is growing on a larger and larger scale for a lot of people. Even normalizing something as simple as identifying people's pronouns is something that not most people are fully comfortable with yet. And so I think that's a great transition into my next question, which is, there are a lot of people who kind of have the mentality that this piece of legislation, that's the final step, that's it, that's the last step in the fight. And so I wanted to know what your perception is on this bill as being a stepping stone or setting the future pace for full marriage protection in the United States. What's next in the fight for LGBTQ plus freedoms here in the United States?
Well, in the arena of marriage and being able to protect our families, I think it's really important to note that there are still 35 states that have either constitutional bans on same-sex marriage or statutory bans on same-sex marriage. And some states have both. You know, we learned when the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade that these matters can go back to the states to decide. And so many states had never gone through the process of repealing their criminal abortion bans. I'll give you my home state of Wisconsin as probably the best example of that. Our criminal abortion ban was passed in 1849. 1 year after Wisconsin became a state. That's how old the law is. And in all of the times that there were opportunities to repeal that, especially after Roe versus Wade was decided in the early 70s, it was never done. And so now it is the law in Wisconsin. So we, as members of the LGBTQ plus community, can look, is our state one of the ones that bans same-sex marriage? Does it do so through statutes? Does it do so through a constitutional amendment? And we can get about the task of trying to unwind that in states where it's prohibited. The Respect for Marriage Act will still require a state like Texas or a state like Wisconsin that does ban same-sex marriage. It will still require that they recognize legally entered into marriages. But it's kind of good to get those things off the books. So that's one area of progress that we have to pursue. The other thing is, outside of the marriage rights and the ability of people in the LGBTQ community to protect their families, we still have ways to go with regard to clarifying individual rights and equality. So in the arena of housing, public accommodations, education, in the arena of jury duty and extension of credit, all important things, we have yet to pass a national law that guarantees equality. Some states have, some states haven't. Some states like Wisconsin have passed laws protecting people on the basis of sexual orientation, but not gender identity. So we have a patchwork quilt of laws at the state and local level, and we have yet to pass the Equality Act, which would guarantee those at the federal level. I want to note one other thing about that is I left out employment in that long list of individual rights. So employment, housing, public accommodation. Employment, there was a major employment case before the United States Supreme Court fairly recently that did decide that our civil rights laws that when we prohibited sex discrimination, that included sexual orientation and gender identity. But again, we know after Roe versus Wade was turned over that we can't just rest on the Supreme Court. We need to codify, we need to pass legislation to make sure that that will remain the law of the land.
You are an openly LGBTQ plus community member. You've been very open about it. What would you say to young people who may not yet feel comfortable being open about who they are? And how do you think that they should go about, expressing themselves or gaining support from either a chosen community or their family, et cetera?
Yeah, well, I came out many years ago. I was actually in the middle of college when I came out to myself and began to come out to others. And at that point in time, in my early 20s, I was thinking to myself, I'm going to have a choice of whether to pursue the career and the interests I have, or be out and be living an honest life. And at first, it didn't occur to me that I could do both until I met role models and other path makers who had done so before me. I get credited a lot with being the first, but before I was the first, there were occasions where I was the second or the third. And those individuals, my mentors, made that I could see that path. And so I encourage folks to look for mentors, look for role models. Maybe that person won't be, somebody you can talk to on the phone or text every day, but also, you need support. These are things that can be often very, very difficult. I was very fortunate when I came out in the 1980s in that my straight friends from, who knew me in elementary school, middle school, and high school, I remember the one who got the angriest said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner? I'm your best friend. How come it took you so long to let me know?" And it was because I was scared, right? I thought, and I didn't get rejected, but that's not the path for everyone. That's not the story for everyone. So yes, find a chosen community of support. I will say that it's so helpful to one's mental health to be able to live your true self.